Have you ever thought about Harriet Tubman's love life? We know about her work with the Underground Railroad, and we know she was a spy during the Civil War, but have you ever thought about her life beyond just being an abolitionist and an activist? Because honestly, her personal affairs were just as intriguing. She was married twice, possibly struggled with her fertility among other health concerns, had her heart broken, and a lot more. And a lot of this was happening while she was helping enslaved people reach their freedom and while doing the work. Honestly, that's the scaled down version of her personal life. So as you could tell, there's a lot about Miss Tubman that I have to tell you about. So with that being said, you have been cordially invited to another episode of I'll Tell You What. I'll Tell You What is a podcast that's all love Black history. I'll Tell You What is presented by Hueido, and I'm Ashley, your favorite raconteuse that can't wait to tell you these love stories every single Monday. So don't forget to follow everywhere you can, subscribe here or on the Tube of You or wherever you listen to podcasts. Join us on the Treon of Pay because we've already decided what the theme for April is going to be. If you've missed any of the recent episodes, like the first Black woman to become a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, Ursula Burns, or the first Black woman billionaire, Sheila Johnson, you must go back and catch up. But if you're ready for the love story of Harriet Tubman, you may now be seated. So, what do you know about Harriet Tubman and her first husband, John? I learned that when they met and were married, she wasn't going by Harriet, but her name her mama gave her, Araminta Ross. It's assumed that she met John while she was working for a man named John Stewart, and either John was working for him too or was in the area. But while we know they got married around 1844, so when Harriet was like 19 or 20, there's no actual documentation of this marriage at all. In the biography, Harriet Tubman, The Road to Freedom by Dr. Catherine Clinton, she wrote, quote, "But how and when they met or any notion of what attracted them to each other remains a mystery, nor are there descriptions of their wedding, record of a date, nor any oral history about the event." The not so fun fact about Black history, especially the history that dives deep into our ancestors' time of enslavement, is that many were not afforded the luxury of having their details recorded. Black history, especially through the context of love, was frequently lost due to the inhumane treatment of our people that were seen as property. What we know is that enslaved couples or intermarried couples where one partner was enslaved and the other was free would jump the broom to symbolize their union, and that a lot of their marriages weren't recorded. But for a large part of Black history through the context of love, that's all we know. So if one person within this marriage was sold, the other wouldn't always wait nor search for their spouse. So you can see how this complicates the romantic histories of our ancestors. So back when they were married, Harriet was enslaved. John was not. Professor Clinton noted that during that time in Maryland, there were more free Black women than free Black men. So because of such, free Black men were essentially anomalies and could have made those men even more desirable to some. So for John to want to marry Harriet, an enslaved woman, meant that he was just as sprung about her. Like, we can imagine, John didn't play about Harriet. It was assumed that they also lived together on the plantation along with Harriet's parents and siblings just because of their union. Now, it's also assumed that John and Harriet tried to conceive a child but didn't find success. Dr. Clinton wrote, quote, "Araminta herself did not yet have any children, but her marriage to John Tubman surely introduced fears for any child she might bear while still enslaved, because as you know, just because one part of this marriage is free, if the mom were to have a child, that child would still be enslaved. So as someone who was deeply committed to her family, not being able to create a child with the one she absolutely loved might have been both disappointing to John and Harriet and could have possibly caused a strain in their marriage. I know. Also, not long after she married John, Harriet began to look into her mother's emancipation, as she believed that she should actually be free based upon the will that was left by her mom's first captor. Now, this might have fueled her desire to get up on out of there. Harriet began to think about a life free with her husband, far, far from Maryland. Except that would not happen. So, 5 years into her marriage to John Tubman, a 25-year-old Harriet decided to seek freedom and run away from this disastrous work-live-play environment called enslavement. She wanted to be free, like her husband, and head north. So when she asked him to accompany her, do you know that this man said nah? Historian Dr. Clinton wrote, quote, "He did not feel the same urgency to relocate." This obviously caused some internal conflict, but Harriet was determined to leave, especially after her master passed away, and there were rumors that possibly her family would get sold and separated. So, in 1949, Harriet headed north. It was then that she changed her name from Araminta Ross Tubman to Harriet Tubman, which paid homage to her mother while continuing to acknowledge her man, her man, her man. She arrived in Pennsylvania and began to get comfortable and set up a life there until she heard that her niece Kizzy and her kids were about to be sold. Now, her niece's husband, a freeman named John Bowley, needed help getting his wife and kids to safety. So this is how Harriet found out. She came back to Maryland to assist in the escape of her family, and the family would be reunited once again. So I guess after that first rescue, she starts to feel the juice, like starts to feel energized from this. So she does it again. So after her second rescue, she reaches out to her husband John by letter and asks him to join her finally. It was less than 2 years since they last saw each other, and Harriet's heart still belonged to John. But the news she discovered likely broke her heart. Not only would John not go back north with her, he had moved on and married a woman named Caroline. Now, according to a biography on her, after finding out this news, Harriet was down bad, as we would all imagine. But eventually, she decided to move on with her life. But before we move on, let's just imagine being the guy that let Harriet Tubman get away. Like decades from now, when people would mention her and all of her accolades, that first time he heard about her and it clicked who they were talking about, he must have felt that burning in his chest. Like, ooh, I know they're not talking about Minty, 5 feet tall, dark skin. John was probably out here like Alonzo Mourning when Miami was getting beat by the Bulls. There was nothing he could do about it. I will. Despite her broken heart, she continued to help others that were in love and wanted to seek a better life together. Like one couple was Harriet's brother William Henry and his girlfriend Catherine. Now, unlike that other William and Kate, they actually knew where that Catherine was. She was enslaved, and her master would not allow her to get married, and William Henry wasn't playing about that, so they had to do what they needed to do. With Harriet's help, of course. And Harriet also helped reunite a couple that had been separated for about 8 years. So she was Moses, but also Cupid. Okay. Years later, Harriet would have helped most of her family escape enslavement and settle into their new lives up north. This would include a particular family member that caused a lot of speculation into Harriet's life later. This is the part of the episode where we must discuss Margaret Tubman. Now, who is Margaret Tubman, you might ask? This is a question that's plagued many historians for decades. Now, to the public, Harriet was a single woman. Those who knew about her ex-husband John recalled that their union never produced a child. So when Harriet, quote, made a trip south and brought back with her a young, light-skinned black girl in the 1850s, people began to wonder, who is this girl? When asked, Harriet said the girl, Margaret, was the daughter of one of her brothers, quote, a niece, whom Harriet adopted and raised as her own. But later, Margaret would say that she was kidnapped by Harriet when she was 8 years old. Dr. Clinton wrote, quote, this would not be so remarkable, but that she claimed she had been living as a free black in relatively comfortable circumstances. For what everyone knew about Harriet, stealing a child for what appeared to be no reason made absolutely no sense. But perhaps this wasn't just some child. Margaret, quote, bore a striking resemblance to Harriet. This led to a common assumption among many. Could Margaret actually be Harriet's biological daughter? The timing of her birth would have been around the time Harriet was married to John. But maybe he wasn't the father. Now, Dr. Clinton explained that if Harriet were ape-rayed, quote, perhaps this also would explain John Tubman's alienation of affection. Despite black women of that era being the victims of sexual assault, sometimes their partners were not as understanding, especially when that assault produced a child or some other physical or mental souvenir. So that, coupled with a strong belief system, that violent act would bring about a lot of shame and internal conflict to the women that were abused, and not really any to the men that did the abusing. Surprise, surprise. Simply put, the truth around Margaret's connection to Harriet was never disclosed. One thing that was obvious was that being close to Margaret brought Harriet a sense of love she likely hadn't felt before. And about a decade or so later, she would actually find more love, but in her next husband. Harriet Tubman met her second husband, Nelson Davis, when he became a boarder at her home in Auburn, New York. This was around winter of 1866. Nelson was an Army veteran turned bricklayer that was over 20 years younger than Harriet, who at the time was in her 40s. Now, it isn't known when they began to date. However, sometime during their courtship, Harriet received news that would be devastating to some while joyous to others. In October of 1867, her first husband, the man that wouldn't escape north with her despite being a free man, the man who moved on from her and broke her heart, John Tubman, was killed. A white man shot him in front of one of his 4 kids. Now, while Harriet must have been saddened by this news, like Celine Dion sung, her heart must go on, and did. Because on March 18, 1869, Harriet and Nelson got married. Harriet kept her ex-husband's surname while adding on Nelson's to the end, frequently going by Harriet Tubman Davis or Mrs. Davis. Now, their community was happy to celebrate the couple's union, especially her family, and knowing all that she had been through. At that point, Harriet Tubman was widely known, so her wedding announcement was news in the local paper. Nelson, unlike John, was a supportive husband. Dr. Clinton wrote, quote, Davis would encourage his wife in her philanthropic endeavors. He assisted her wherever he could and was the proud husband of Harriet Tubman. Sometime during their marriage, Harriet and Nelson adopted a daughter named Gertie. Now, there's not a lot that we know about Gertie other than seeing her in a few family photos and that she allegedly passed away at a very young age. Speaking of being gone too soon, despite Nelson being considerably younger than Harriet, he struggled with tuberculosis from the time she met him. His health continued to fail to the point where he couldn't continue to work, which caused a financial strain on the family. Sadly, by October 1888, and after 19 years of marriage to Harriet, Nelson passed away. Her husband's death gave her the ability to get veterans benefits, which allowed her to receive $8 a month. That was a lot of money. Harriet would live almost 25 additional years after Nelson died. On March 10th, 1913, Harriet passed away after a battle with an illness. So outside of her life as an abolitionist, one that brought about 70 people to freedom, a feminist, and an overall activist, she was a wife, a mother, an aunt, a sister, a daughter, and simply a person. Someone who emoted, someone who hurt, someone who struggled, someone who persevered. Through her 90 plus years of life, she lived and loved as fully as she could. And that, aisle runners, concludes the love story of Harriet Tubman. We're wrapping our Black Women in Excellence series this month with another great love story next week. So subscribe, follow, share, and come back. See you in the pews.